A magnificent mansion in Westchester gleamed beneath the crimson autumn leaves, concealing a secret that would soon ignite a raging fire. Nora Ellison stepped through the door, frail after a battle with pneumonia, hoping for the comforting arms of her husband to care for her in these weakened days. But instead, she found him tangled in bed with her own mother, their laughter like knives plunging into her soul. The wind howled, the roses trembled, and the betrayed woman turned into a storm of vengeance. Before we dive into this dramatic story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming tales. And be sure to leave a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Now, dear audience, let's listen to the story together. The hospital floor felt like a cold shock against my bare feet, and the sterile chill seeped into my bones as I stood there shaking with the weight of freedom. 3 weeks ago, pneumonia had chained me to a bed, my lungs burning and my life a thin thread. Now Dr. Ellis's words, "Nora, you're not fully healed, but you can recover at home," echoed in my mind, and I didn't wait to call Daniel my husband of 9 years or pause to warn anyone. The idea of surprising him, of sneaking into our Westchester haven, our colonial dream purchased with my father's inheritance, made my heart race. I was alive, and I wanted to feel the warmth of our life once more. God, how I wish I had called, how I wish I'd stayed one more night in that sterile cage. Our home was a beacon at the end of the drive. The cab wound through the quiet streets of Westchester, the autumn leaves ablaze with crimson and gold. Daniel's sleek BMW sat in its usual spot. No surprise for a Wednesday afternoon, he often worked from his study papers, scattered like a scholar's battlefield. However, my mother's silver Mercedes, parked boldly behind, stopped me in my tracks. Vivian 57 had been my rock since I became ill, taking care of the house, bringing Daniel meals, and visiting my hospital bed with gentle words and fake smiles. Just yesterday, she sat by me, her perfume heavy, saying nothing of coming here, and a flicker of relief. Together, they would make my homecoming a celebration, a reunion of the family that had supported me. The house loomed its white columns proud, but the silence was wrong heavy, like the air before a storm. Turning my key, I eased the door open, eager to surprise them, see Daniel's face light up and feel my mother's arms around me. The foyer was dim, the grandfather clock ticking away like a heartbeat in the quiet. Then I heard a sound from upstairs, sharp, unmistakable laughter, not the canned chuckle of a television, but Vivian's laugh, that high, flirtatious cackle she unleashed at galas, her martinis loosening her charm. My hand froze on the doorknob, my pulse a drum in my ears. "No," I whispered, my mind foggy, the medications blurring my senses. The door to the master bedroom was open, a sliver of light spilling into the hall, and before I reached the top, Vivian's breathless, teasing voice cut through me. "She'll never know, Danny. What happens when Nora's away stays ours." Danny is my name for him. The one I'd whispered in our vows, the one I'd murmured in our bed, and I pushed the door open. My fingers shaking and the world I knew vanished. They were in our bed, the bed where Daniel had held me through nightmares, where we had planned our future. My mother, Vivian 57, was straddling my husband, Daniel 38, with her silk blouse unbuttoned, their faces flushed with a joy that wasn't mine. They didn't see me, didn't hear the wounded gasp that tore from my throat, a sound I didn't recognize, raw animal. Their heads snapped toward me, pleasure turning to horror. Daniel shoved Vivian off the sheets, tangled, as he stammered, his voice a stranger's, It's not what it looks like." Vivian clutched her blouse. Her face a mask of shock, but her eyes were filled with calculation rather than regret. "Darling, you're supposed to be in the hospital," she said, as if my early release was the crime, as if I'd interrupted their sacred moment. Together in my bed, my mother, who had braided my hair, taught me to dance and wept with me at my father's funeral 2 years ago. And my husband, who had promised forever and kissed my forehead as I battled for my life, wondered how long I would be unable to breathe. The grip of pneumonia was nothing compared to this suffocation, this betrayal that tore at my soul. I choked, clutching the doorframe, my legs trembling. Their quick, guilty look was a response, a confession of months, maybe years. "Nora, you're still recovering?" Vivian said, buttoning her blouse, her voice brimming with fictitious concern. "Let's talk when you're stronger." The cruelty and the audacity ignited something inside of me. "Get out," I screamed, and the force of my voice tore at my lungs, causing a coughing fit that knocked me down twice. Daniel clambered into his trousers and begged his eyes wide. Baby, please, it was a mistake, a terrible mistake. However, I spotted the lie. A mistake. Vivian came up with her hand outstretched and said, Nora, sweetie, you're overwrought. Sit down before you collapse. I recoiled at her poisonous touch, saying, Don't you dare act like you care, Daniel. This is a mistake, a vile choice you made while I was dying in a hospital. I spat, my voice icy. Daniel reached for me and said, Nora, you're sick. Let me take you back to the hospital. I slapped his hand away and whispered, too weak to scream, but something inside me hardened a seed of resolve taking root. Their eyes met again, a silent agreement, a history I hadn't seen. My legs gave way and I sank to the floor, the dizziness a wave, my body betraying me as they had. They rushed down the stairs, half-dressed, their voices overlapping. I looked at Daniel, who had supported me during my father's death and had promised to love me through good times and bad, and Vivian, who had taught me strength and walked me down the aisle when my father was unable to. Their betrayal was like a blade, piercing through every memory and every trust. However, my father's voice echoed, Nora, wealth is luck, but power is strategy. I wasn't weak, not as they thought or as they had hoped. I need to lie down. I said, my voice steady despite the fever burning my skin. Then we'll talk about what's next. They heard reconciliation, perhaps forgiveness, but I meant retribution, a plan forming in the shadows of my pain. They had destroyed my world, but I would rebuild it not with tears, but with a fire they wouldn't see coming. Their excuses were pitiful and predictable, and Daniel paced the living room saying, It just happened, Nora. I was lonely, worried about you. Vivian was here and we drank too much. I stared at him, my voice raw from coughing. You accidentally fell into my mother. The next few days were a storm of grief and rage. Daniel moved to the guest room at my insistence, and his presence was a wound I couldn't escape. Vivian returned to her condo across town, her calls unrelenting, her voicemails tearful. Nora, we're family. Please let me explain. Daniel, how long? A few months, he muttered, but Vivian's confession, which she delivered with a bowl of soup she dared to bring, was worse. It started at your father's memorial, Nora. We were grieving. It just happened, he said, unable to meet my eyes. My father's memorial, while I arranged his service, chose his songs, and greeted mourners, they'd been stealing moments building their betrayal. He said, a few months. With a sharp voice, I muttered, Since Dad died, I gestured to the door and said, Get out, I can't look at you. As she nodded with a flash of humiliation. Not continuously. We tried to stop. As if raising me justified her sin, they kept coming back, Daniel, with flowers and vows of loyalty, and Vivian with tears and reminders of her sacrifices. They believed I was becoming weak and didn't notice the calls I made while they were away, or the laptop I insisted on having despite my alleged rest. I called my father's lawyer, Samuel Carter, a man Dad trusted with his empire, and said, Nora, I'm horrified, in a steady voice over the secure line. Not forgive or wait, but action. I want to change my will and my finances, and I need to know about Vivian's situation, I said firmly. She's been living beyond her means since Dad died, and I need to know why. Samuel paused, then said, We should meet, Nora. There are things about your parents' arrangements that your father wanted you to know eventually. His words were a spark igniting the plan I had only just started to form. They believed they had broken me, but I was just starting to get back up. Outside my Westchester home, the autumn leaves fell like silent tears, their crimson and gold a mournful dance against the windows. I sat in the study, my father's old desk, a fortress, its oak worn smooth by his hands, his absence a weight in the air. A week had gone by since I'd stumbled into the nightmare of Daniel and Vivian's betrayal. My lungs still fragile. My heart a raw wound, but my mind was a river carving a path through grief toward purpose. The house was quiet, Daniel exiled to the guest room, his footsteps cautious. Vivian's calls unanswered, her voicemails piling like stones. They believed I was broken, a frail thing to be soothed with flowers and lies. They failed to notice the fire burning inside of me, unaware that I was already crafting a plan as sharp as a hawk's talon to reclaim my power. Every night while Daniel slept, I worked covertly using my laptop's glow as a beacon in the dark. My father's strategy lessons guided me as I combed through our financial records, finding discrepancies. Vivian's extravagant spending since his death trips to Paris, a new wardrobe, a life beyond the inheritance he'd left her. Daniel's accounts revealed strange transfers, small but frequent to accounts I didn't recognize. My suspicions grew a seed sprouting in the soil of their deceit. I needed answers not just about their affair, but also about the deeper roots of their betrayal. My father's lawyer, Samuel Carter, was my first port of call. His call had promised truths my father intended for me, truths that could shift the ground beneath my enemies. I met Samuel at his Manhattan office, a haven of leather and mahogany with the smell of old books, and my father's favorite cologne lingering like a ghost. Samuel, 60, had kind but sharp eyes, and as I walked in, he said, "Nora, I'm so sorry for what you're enduring." His voice a steady drum. "Your father would be heartbroken but proud of your strength," I said, keeping my hands steady despite the fever that still gripped me. "I need to know everything, Samuel, about Vivian's finances, about what Dad wanted me to understand." He nodded, sliding a folder across the desk, its weight heavy with secrets. "Your father uncovered something before he died, Nora. Something about Vivian. It's why he changed his will and why she's been living as she has." I was astounded by the contents of the folder, which included bank statements, property deeds, text messages, and a story of betrayal that predated my marriage. Samuel's voice was gentle but firm. "Vivian was unfaithful during your father's illness, not with Daniel, but with his business partner, Edward Vance. Edward was my father's confidant, the man who had carried his coffin, and he had referred to me as Little Nora during family dinners." Samuel's revelation sliced through my memories. Dad discovered the truth 6 months prior to his death, transferring most of his estate into a trust for you at 35. However, this will disappeared after his death, and the previous version, which gave Vivian nearly half the estate, was executed instead. The papers shuddered as my hands gripped the folder more tightly. "Gone." How Samuel's eyes darkened as he said, "We have evidence, Nora, text messages between Vivian and Edward. They planned to hide the new will to ensure the old one stood. They discussed it explicitly, how to keep your father's final wishes buried." I stared at the messages, and Vivian's words were cold and calculated. "The new will can't surface Edward, will lose everything. My mother, who had held my hand at Dad's bedside and who had cried at his funeral, had betrayed him as he lay dying and had stolen my inheritance, my father's legacy." Samuel added, "There's more. Vivian's spending the extravagance. It's funded by assets she siphoned from the estate. Assets meant for you. She and Edward have been living off your father's wealth while you grieved. My mother, not satisfied with destroying my father, had turned her ambition to my marriage to Daniel." "Why Daniel?" she asked, as the room whirled and my lungs burned as though the sickness had returned. My voice was like a cracked reed as I muttered, "Why my husband?" Samuel bent forward and said, "I can't know her heart, Nora, but your father suspected Vivian envied you, your bond with him, your inheritance, your life with Daniel, who benefited from your family's connections. Perhaps taking Daniel was her way of claiming what she felt you didn't deserve." The words fell like stones, one after the other, and each one got deeper. Vivian's jealousy, a poison I had never seen, had festered for years, turning her love into a weapon. I drove home with the folder clutched to my chest, the city's pulse roaring in my ears, the autumn wind sharp, carrying the scent of rain and resolve. The plan Samuel and I had started to craft was elegant and precise, avoiding the mess of court battles. First, I would change my will to deny Daniel and Vivian any claim to my wealth and redirect it to a foundation in my father's name. Second, I would confront Vivian with the evidence and demand that she return the stolen assets or face exposure and charges. Third, I would unravel Daniel's career built on my family's connections, leaving him nothing but the ashes of his ambition. They had underestimated me, seeing only the sick woman and the grieving daughter, and they were unaware of the strength my father had forged in me, the fire now burning bright. I pretended to be the wounded wife back home, leading Daniel to believe that forgiveness was possible. He brought my favorite Thai takeout and sat on the edge of our bed, his eyes begging, Nora, I love you, only you. It was a mistake with Vivian meaningless. His words were a lie, and his hands twisted the way they did when he hid the truth. I let real tears fall for the love I'd lost, and I said, I need time, Daniel. This isn't something I can just forget. He nodded relief, softening his face, believing that my suffering was his salvation. Vivian was no different, her voicemails a performance. Nora, you're all I have. We're blood. Let me explain. And I agreed to meet her at a cafe, a neutral place where I could witness her lies unravel. There was a hum of voices and clinking cups in the cafe when Vivian arrived with a sapphire necklace that I had admired months earlier. She practiced her smile and said, Nora, I know I've hurt you, but we can heal this. We're family. I let her speak, and she made a prepared request for forgiveness before I leaned forward and spoke softly but firmly. I need to ask you something, Vivian. Did you ever cheat on Dad throughout all of your years together? Of course not. Your father and I were happy. She said, her eyes flashing as her teacup clattered. So why, Daniel, why, of all men, my husband? I need time, Vivian, but maybe we can work through this. She twisted her wedding ring, which she was still wearing 2 years after Dad passed away. It wasn't planned, Nora. He was there grieving with me. It just happened. Her voice was weak. Her lie was transparent, and I smiled with predatory composure. Her relief was evident as she squeezed my hand. She didn't realize I had her secrets and didn't see the trap closing around her. I sat in the study that night with the folder open and my father's portrait on the wall. His steady, proud eyes seemed to urge me on. The evidence was a weapon, but the plan was my shield. Daniel and Vivian believed they had won and that their lies would hold, but they were wrong. The roots of their betrayal ran deep, but I was digging deeper, uncovering truths that would free my justice. The leaves outside fell more quickly, and the wind whispered of the impending storm, and I knew that this was just the beginning. The wind howled through the oaks of Westchester, its voice a chorus of restless spirits, and I stood in my garden with the roses my father planted, shaking under a gray dawn, their thorns catching the light sharp as my resolve. 2 weeks after I discovered the full extent of Vivian and Daniel's betrayal, my heart was a scarred earth. But my will was a flame that was growing brighter. Together with Samuel Carter, I meticulously crafted a plan of justice, ensuring each thread was precise and each knot unbreakable. Today, I'd deliver the first blows not with screams, but with the quiet power of truth, and both Daniel's career and Vivian's pride would start to fall apart. The roses watched their petals fierce, as if they knew the fire I carried, as if they were hungry for reckoning. I wore a charcoal blazer and skirt, my dark hair pinned tight, and my eyes were clear in the mirror. The woman staring back was not the Nora who had collapsed at her bedroom door. Rather, she was carved from betrayal, honed by strategy, her weakness a mask now shed. My first blow was directed at Daniel's pride and his position at Sterling Ventures, the venture capital firm he had climbed through my family's connections. I gathered my dossier, a sleek folder full of evidence emails, financial reports, proof of his exaggerated claims, all mined from our shared accounts. My father's lessons in precision directing my search. I drove to Manhattan, the bustle of the city serving as a drumbeat to my purpose, and my destination wasn't Daniel's office, but his mentor, Margaret Hensley, the founder of Sterling, a woman who valued loyalty above all else. The Hudson River glinted beyond the glass tower that was Margaret's office. She stood up as I walked in, her silver braid gleaming. Nora, it's been too long. She murmured, her grin warm, then wavering. Is everything okay? I sat with the dossier unopened in my lap and spoke as steadily as a still lake. Margaret, I'm here about Daniel, about something I found while preparing for our divorce. Her eyes narrowed, but she leaned forward and listened. I slid the documents across the desk, proof of Daniel's falsified reports credit he'd stolen from my family's introductions funds. He'd diverted to personal accounts. I uncovered the fraud in our joint finances. I said, my tone heavy with regret. I couldn't keep it from you, not with Sterling's reputation at stake. Margaret's face tightened, her fingers, tracking the evidence, shock turning to resolve. Nora, this is grave, a betrayal of trust. How long has this been going on? I shook my head and said, "Months, maybe longer. I'm sorry to tell you, but I had to." She looked at me and asked, "Is Daniel aware that you're here?" "No, and I'd prefer he didn't, not from me," I said, holding her eyes. "You have my word, Nora. Thank you for your honesty," she said, nodding firmly. I walked out of the building with a steady pulse. By noon, Daniel would have to face a meeting that he couldn't avoid accusations supported by evidence he couldn't deny, and his career and the empire he'd built on my family's name would start to fall apart. My first strike was clean and true, but my second strike was directed at Vivian's pride and her social throne among Westchester's elite. I set up a lunch with Claire and David, old country club friends whose loyalty had been torn since I was ill. We met at a quiet bistro in the crisp autumnal air, and I stirred my tea, speaking softly but deliberately. "I know you've been kind to Vivian, but there's something you should know before you choose her side." I slid my phone across the table open to texts I'd found in Daniel's cloud messages between him and Vivian that weren't just recent, but went all the way back to my father's memorial. David's eyes darted from the television to me in a fit of rage as Claire's face went pale and her breath caught. "This was while you were in the hospital." Claire's palm trembled as he said, "Vivian always spoke so highly of you. How could she—" And before it started at Dad's memorial, "They used my grief, my illness as their cover," he said softly. I nodded, my tone sympathetic. The seed was sown when I leaned forward and said, "It's a pattern, Claire. She's done this before, not just with Daniel." By evening, the country club would be filled with rumors. Vivian's name, a stain her allies, turning her social world coming apart. The second flame burning softer, but its heat would spread a wound that would linger in her gilded circles. "I've drafted the new will," Samuel said, spreading documents in front of me. "Daniel and Vivian are removed. Your estate goes to the Robert Ellison Foundation for Ethical Business, as you wanted." I signed my hand, steady the act, a vow to my father's legacy. The third strike was for both a quiet move to tighten the noose. I met Samuel again, this time at home, the study a war room, my father's portrait, a silent witness. "We've traced more Nora Properties accounts, all tied to the estate she hid. We can demand their return or expose her fraud with Edward." "Your call," I said, my voice a blade. Samuel's eyes gleaming. "Prepare the ultimatum, but hold it. I want her to feel the ground shift first," Samuel said with a warrior's respect. "Your father would admire this, Nora. Not just the plan, but your precision." I nodded. Daniel came back that night with a pale face and a tightly gripped suitcase. "Nora, they're looking into me at Sterling." He murmured, his voice trailing off. "Someone turned in reports, lies about my work." I cocked my head, my face gentle. "Lies. Or anything you wanted to conceal." The first fracture in his confidence appeared when Vivian called an hour later. Her voice shrill. "Nora, people are talking. Claire won't return my calls. What's happening?" His eyes widened, suspicion flaring, but I got up and said calmly, "We'll talk later, Daniel. I'm tired." They were starting to feel the heat, but they hadn't yet seen the conflagration. I waited for a moment before saying, "Maybe they're seeing you clearly, Vivian. Maybe they know who you are." I hung up her gasp, adding fuel to my fire. That night, I sat in the garden with the roses glowing under the moon, my dossier a map of victories yet to come. Daniel's career teetered, Vivian's social world was frayed, and the will secured my father's legacy. Each strike had landed true, but they were only the opening notes of my song. I sipped tea, feeling the storm inside me grow, and realized that Daniel and Vivian had thought they had seen my worst. They were mistaken. The true reckoning waited, its shadow lengthening, and I would wield it like a blade forged in my father's strength, tempered by my pain. The wind sang louder. The roses stood taller, and I knew the fire was just starting to blaze. The oaks whispered of my victories, but my heart was no longer a flame. It was a river, fierce but heavy, bearing the weight of justice and a new question. What did my vengeance cost me? 3 weeks had passed since I'd set Daniel's career on fire, since I'd cracked Vivian's social throne like brittle stone, and the roses in my garden stood sentinel under a restless moon. Their petals silvered their thorns, a silent vow. The wind sang low, carrying the scent of rain and reckoning. I was standing in the dining room, my father's portrait looking on my dossier, a map of facts. Yet my reflection in the glass revealed eyes that were searching for something more than vengeance, a tranquility I had not yet attained. As I had planned, Daniel's downfall came quickly. By noon on the day I met Margaret Hensley, Sterling Ventures had suspended him their investigation, a noose around his ambition. Whispers reached me through Claire Daniels' face was gray as he left the office. His charm useless against the evidence I'd provided his allies at the firm turned their loyalty to Margaret and Sterling's reputation outweighing his lies. My second strike had burned brighter with Claire and David's lunch, igniting a firestorm among Westchester's elite. Vivian's name was now a curse at the country club. Her invitations disappeared. Her calls went unanswered, and friends who had once flocked to her galas now avoided her, sending me gentle but firm texts. Nora, we're with you. We didn't know. Her empire of influence crumbled, leaving her exposed a queen without a court. Vivian was my mother, the woman who had taught me to dream and who had supported me through my father's death. But her betrayal left a wound that bled deeper and deeper with every new revelation. I ignored the thought and concentrated on the last stage, the confrontations that would end their lives. That morning, I sent a sharp text to Daniel. We need to discuss the divorce. Come to the house tonight, 7 p.m., alone. His response was desperate, a glimmer of hope in his panic. Thank you, Nora. I'll be there. I set up the dining room like a battlefield with my father's favorite Bach music playing softly, a single folder in front of me, and 2 glasses of wine poured their crimson glow, catching the light from the chandelier. The folder contained a portion of my evidence enough to wound but not destroy. I had drafted a divorce settlement that was fair by law, but it came with a price Daniel would have to sign, or I would release the entire dossier, a reckoning that would end his future. Nora, he said, his voice low. Thank you for this. I know I've hurt you. I raised a hand, interrupting him. Sit, Daniel. This isn't forgiveness. He sat, fear sharpening his features, and I pushed it toward him, my voice steady as stone. This isn't the settlement. It's what happens if you fight me. Open it. His hands trembled as he leafed through the documents, proof of his financial misconduct texts with Vivian, a timeline of their affair all laid bare. Why show me this? You've already ruined me, Nora Sterling, our friends. He said, his voice shaking. Because this is just the spark, I continued, meeting his gaze. The Sterling investigation. The Westchester whispers me. Me, what's really going on between you and Vivian? I slid the settlement across the table and said, sign this. You walk away with enough to survive, not thrive. The investigation closes quietly. Refuse and I burn it all down. He looked at me, seeing me again, and said, this, I tapped the folder, is a warning. Fight the divorce and the full dossier goes to the SEC, to your clients, and to the IRS for your hidden accounts. You won't just lose your job, Daniel. You'll lose your freedom, your name. He looked at me. Who are you? I leaned closer and spoke sharply as he muttered, You're not the Nora I married. You just never saw me. You broke my world, Daniel. Don't test whether I'll break yours. I need time. He said, standing. I'll think about it. And I nodded, letting him go, knowing that my words would haunt him. The choice was his, but the outcome was mine. The following day, I turned to Vivian, her punishment a sharper fire. I met her at the same cafe, her face gaunt, her eyes red from sleepless nights. Nora, you've turned everyone against me, she said, her voice shaking. I'm your mother. How could you? I'm giving you a chance to make this right, Vivian. Sign over the assets you stole from Dad's estate, the ones you and Edward hid, or I expose you to the courts, to Westchester, to everyone who still thinks you're a saint. Her cup clattered. Her face looked pale. You don't understand, Nora. I did what I had to. I said, sipping my coffee, its bitterness reflecting my heart. I interrupted in a low voice, saying, You betrayed Dad when he was dying. Then you took my husband. Don't speak to me of necessity. I slid a document across the table that contained Samuel's ruthless and clean ultimatum. Sign this. You keep enough to live, but the estate returns to me. Should you choose not to agree, I will proceed with filing charges for fraud. Your choice, Vivian. Her eyes met mine, searching for the daughter she had raised, but finding only the woman I had become. You're so cold. She whispered, her eyes welling with tears. What happened to my little girl? She glanced at the document, her fingers shaking, then pushed it back. I can't not yet, I said, leaning forward. You and Daniel have caused this, Vivian. Sign the document or you will lose everything. I stepped up, leaving her with the ultimatum, her sobbing a faint echo as I left. As the wind grew colder, whispering of the cost, Samuel called, his voice urgent. Daniel's asking to meet again, Nora. He's desperate. He says he'll sign. Vivian's been calling too. She's rattled. What do you want to do? That evening, I sat in the garden with the roses fierce under the stars, Daniel's unsigned settlement and Vivian's refusal lying heavy on my desk, twin challenges unanswered. As planned, my revenge had torn apart their worlds, yet the victory was tinged with bitterness as I had exposed their deceit. With the thorns of the flowers gleaming, I paused and said, set the meetings for tomorrow. Same place, same time. Worry. The last stage was approaching, but a shadow was growing inside of me. My justice was afire, but would it devour me as well? I knew the answer awaited me in the quiet following, not in flames as I gazed at the stars whose light was steady yet far away. It had been 3 months since I'd given Daniel and Vivian my ultimatums. 3 months since I'd stood at the edge of my vengeance, wondering how much it would cost. And 3 months since I'd stood on the porch of my new home, a modest cottage in Rye with my coffee warm in my hands. The fire I'd unleashed had burned clean. Its ashes settled, but the question still hung like a shadow. Who was I now beyond the betrayed, beyond the avenger? The roses encouraged me to move forth into a dawn that I had created for myself because they understood that their roots were deep in my father's soil. Daniel's surrender came quickly. The morning after our confrontation, a courier delivered the signed divorce settlement. Its pages stark. His signature a trembling line, and tucked inside was a note. His words unsteady, Nora. I'm sorry. You were right. I never saw you. I'm gone. I read it once, then put it aside, its weight no longer mine to carry. The settlement was fair as I'd designed, giving him enough to live, but not to thrive. Sterling Ventures had fired him, his reputation a whisper of what it was. His allies silent, and he'd moved to Boston, his dreams of empire reduced to a desk and a paycheck. I felt no victory, just a quiet certainty. He'd chosen his path, and I'd made sure it led away from me, a mercy I granted not for him, but for the woman I was becoming. When Vivian arrived at my cottage 2 days after our cafe meeting, her face was hollow, and her hands were gripping the signed document. Her voice was brittle as she said, Nora, I've done what you asked. The assets are yours. Please, can we talk? Her reckoning was sharper, her defiance crumbling under the weight of the ultimatum. I took the papers, my eyes cold, and said, there's nothing left to say, Vivian. You stole from Dad and from me. You took my husband. This, I held up the document, is justice, not reconciliation. Her tears brought no sympathy, only a slight pain for the mother she had been before she left her Mercedes. A fading glint, her condo hers to keep, but her wealth and status gone. Westchester's elite had closed their doors. Her name a warning, and she would live. But in shadows, a life deprived of the grandeur she'd betrayed us for. You've reclaimed everything, Samuel Carter said, his eyes warm. The estate is yours, the foundation funded, and your father's wishes honored. I nodded. The Robert Ellison Foundation, now my purpose. Its mission to foster ethical business, a tribute to Dad's principles. The final meeting with Samuel Carter was a ritual, a sealing of my father's legacy. We met in his Manhattan office, the mahogany desk a bridge to my past. Your father would be proud, Nora. Not just of your justice, but of your heart. I said, my voice steady. Samuel's smile grim. He's cooperating, returning his share of the stolen assets. He knows exposure would ruin him. I signed the final documents, my hand steady each stroke, a vow to carry forward, not as a victim, but as a steward of truth. Samuel clasped my hand. The months that followed were an introspective journey, a spiral through the ashes of my former life. I sold the Westchester house because the memories were too heavy, and I moved to Rye where my cottage was a canvas of my own making. The garden was filled with roses that I had planted and their roots were mine. I traveled not to get away, but to rediscover in Florence where I walked cobblestone streets, and the Arno's flow served as a mirror for my recovery. In Dublin, I joined a writer's circle whose stories inspired mine. In Kyoto, I sat by a temple pond and wrote a letter to myself. Nora, you faced betrayal and rose. You wove justice with accuracy, not rage. You are not what was taken, but what you built. Walk forward, always forward. I sealed it, tucked it into my bag, a talisman for the path ahead. My career took off back in Rye, and I was promoted thanks to my newfound clarity. The foundation expanded and its influence rippled across industries, leaving a legacy that my father would be proud of. One evening, Claire called me warmly, saying, Nora, your strength saved us from Vivian's lies. You didn't just survive, you reshaped the world. I smiled, the wind singing in my ears, and she said, It wasn't about saving anyone, Claire. It was about claiming my truth. She paused and then said, You did more, Nora. You became someone new. A truth I was only now starting to realize. A year to the day after I had walked into Daniel and Vivian's betrayal, I stood in my garden pruning roses under a golden sun. The Rye cottage was small, but every inch was mine, chosen and loved. The divorce had left me safe, and I was learning to trust myself again, not in other people, but in myself. I thought of Daniel, whose diminished life was a shadow of his choices. Of Vivian, who lived a quiet life, her calls and pleas going unanswered. And of Samuel, my guide, whose faith had kept me afloat. The journey had been a spiral, not a line, each turn revealing a deeper strength. I held a rose, its scent sharp and sweet, and I saw the truth as clear as the sky. My father's voice echoed, Nora, true wealth is what no one can steal. I had lost a husband and a mother, but I had found something unassailable, my worth forged in pain, tempered by justice, radiant in its freedom. That evening, I raised a glass to the woman I'd become, the sun sinking into the earth, casting gold across my roses. The worst thing that had happened to me had led to the person I was most proud of. That was my revenge, not a moment, but a life. Not a fire, but a dawn. And unlike Daniel's promises or Vivian's dreams, it would endure as steady as the wind, as fierce as the roses in my garden.